So we've been discussing the 1920s, and now we're into sort of like the political side of the 1920s. So we've already mentioned that the president in the 1920s, really for the beginning, is going to be Warren G. Harding. So I've already told you, that the economy is Harding's really number one priority, and that's what he's been working on. And he is really remembered for that, and for being such a good sort of fiscal leader. But at the same time, he is also really remembered for a lot of the corruption and scandal that goes on during his presidency. It's very similar to what happened with Ulysses S. Grant. It's not necessarily that he himself is corrupt, but he's definitely surrounded by a lot of corrupt politicians. Now, Harding was originally from Ohio, and when he was in Ohio, he had been surrounded by a lot of like greedy businessmen, people who were sort of just like using his position for their own personal gain, like fake friends. I'm sure we can all relate. And when he is elected president, a lot of them use even that position more to persuade him to like give them government jobs, and then they use those jobs to embezzle money. So here on the right is you see that in the middle there is Harding, and then he's surrounded by this group of guys, and we call them the Ohio Gang, all these politicians and businessmen that he brought in from the state of Ohio. For example, Charles Forbes, who was the head of the Veterans Bureau, said that he was spending $70,000 on floor cleaner. Obviously, he really wasn't. He was just using that as an excuse to embezzle the money, sort of like how Boss Tweed would embezzle money from the city treasury in New York. The Attorney General, Harry Dougherty, would take bribes from criminals in exchange for like not prosecuting them or prosecuting them for lesser crimes. So sort of like the most textbook definition of corruption you could possibly think of. But definitely the most famous scandal during Harding's presidency is the Teapot Dome scandal. So the Secretary of the Interior was Albert Fall, and we see him here on the left side of the slide. So Albert Fall, as Secretary of the Interior, is responsible for basically everything that happens within our borders that doesn't fall into some other category. It's like, for example, education happens within our borders, but that would fall under the Department of Education. So the Secretary of Interior handles everything that doesn't have a designated department, but is a domestic issue. So in 1921, Albert Fall signed some orders that transferred these oil reserves that we had in the United States in Elk Hills and Teapot Dome, Wyoming. Elk Hills is in California. So we had these oil reserves in California and in Wyoming that were supposed to be in case of emergency. Like if something happened and we needed access to oil immediately and we didn't have it somewhere else, then we had these reserves sort of on standby. And they were under the control of the Navy. And in 1921, Albert Fall signed over these oil reserves to the Department of Interior, so that now he's in charge of them. Then, once they were under his power, he started leasing the properties to different businessmen and oil companies in return for bribes. So not only is he really placing us in a dangerous situation by allowing people to drill on this land, but he's pocketing the money for it. So he will get caught and ends up spending a year in prison because of it. So that was the Teapot Dome scandal. Now, unfortunately for Warren Harding, he dies of a stroke in his sleep on August 2nd of 1923. So his one and only term is going to be cut short. So his vice president will be sort of up to bat and sworn in immediately, and his name is Calvin Coolidge, nicknamed Silent Cal. So Cal was definitely different in terms of personality from Warren Harding. Harding was much more boisterous and outgoing and loud, and Coolidge was very much more quiet and reserved and really chose his words very carefully. Now he's going to continue all of Harding's work on the economy in favor of businesses and is going to be very successful. He keeps on Andrew Mellon as his Secretary of Treasury, and the two of them will continue to work hard on the economy. But not everything is, bright and shiny and wonderful. We still have problems in the 1920s. A lot of our farmers are still suffering, and labor unions are still making things difficult for businesses and for the government. There's still plenty of discrimination and racism in the 1920s, and we'll talk about more of that in a separate video. So after World War I, we are taking on a more global role in the United States. We are really killing it in really every capacity that you can think of. We are the wealthiest country in the world. We're the largest creditor in the world, and we are the most industrialized country in the world. So even though we're not even though we're not necessarily in the League of Nations, we still want to set a positive example, and we want to be involved in maintaining global peace and helping the economy, especially after such a devastating war for so much of Europe. So the 1920s, we're really going to try to hold up sort of that idea of ourselves as sort of like a global power. So in the 1920s, we will help to organize and host the Washington Naval Disarmament Conference, which was an international conference where all of these different countries agreed to limit the construction of warships. So we're basically going to be disarming our Navy, exactly like it says in the title. We're going to be, it's sort of like a sign of goodwill. You don't need a small Navy if you plan on going to war soon. So by everyone reducing the size of their military, specifically their Navy, it's sort of like sending the signal that we are trying to maintain peace among all nations. In 1928, we will hold another convention and help to write the Kellogg-Brand Pact. The Kellogg-Brand Pact is, you see it here on the left. It basically outlaws war. Obviously, that sounds totally pointless, and they didn't really necessarily mean to outlaw war. They knew that that's not really a thing that you can do, but it was more about sort of setting the example of maintaining all of that peace and everything. Germany is really struggling economically. We'll talk about that a lot more in Unit 4 when we get to World War II. I'll give you sort of a background on what's been going on in Germany since World War I and the conditions that sort of like made it so perfect for Hitler to come to power. But Germany has really been devastated in every sense of the word, economically, politically, everything. And they really are having a difficult time because they can't pay back these reparations that they owe to us in Great Britain and France. And then on top of that, Great Britain and France, because of that, can't pay back their loans to us. We loaned Great Britain and France money at the beginning of the war, and they're supposed to be able to pay us back because they're getting all these reparations from Germany. Now, it's not really killing us not getting these reparation payments immediately because, like I said, we're sort of rolling in the money over here. But Great Britain and France can't afford to do that. Plus, the longer it takes them to get paid back, the longer it will take us to get paid back from them. So we're going to loan money to Germany so that they could pay back Great Britain and France, so that Great Britain and France could pay back the United States. And I know that sounds crazy because it sounds like we're basically loaning ourselves money. And that's because it is crazy. We were basically loaning ourselves money. And I'm sure that we knew that. I think it was more about just sort of like, hey, look at us. Look at what we're doing to help grow the economy and help rebuild a country that we had previously been fighting in. So I think it was more of like I don't know. I think it was just sort of like to help everyone feel better. I don't think it was necessarily because we thought that was really going to make much of a difference. Oh, too far. So as all of these ideas are growing in Europe, like communism after the Bolshevik Revolution, and we see an entire country go communist, we're really starting to come to terms with the fact that ideas like that are spreading and becoming so popular, especially with such a desperate situation that people are living in right now in Eastern Europe with what has happened at the end of the war. Aside from communism, which is still growing, fascism is growing, socialism is growing, anarchy is growing. Really, all of these really radical political ideas are becoming very popular, and we're getting a lot of immigrants from those places. So we're paranoid about those ideas spreading in the United States. So we're going to see this push to hold on to traditional values and morals in the 1920s. That's one of the reasons why prohibition is going to happen in the 1920s. There's going to be this increased emphasis on education, really pushing the importance of education and educating our future generation to understand the positive effects of democracy and how our political structure works and things like that. At the same time, we're also going to see a big rise in Christian fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is when you take the Bible literally, the belief that all of the stories in the Bible are 100% literal. Not all Christians take the Bible to be 100% literal, but fundamentalists do. And seeing this increase in fundamentalism and this new importance being placed on education, that's going to sort of be the recipe for this really, really famous court case called the Scopes trial in 1925. So in 1925, Tennessee Public Schools passed a law called the Butler Act, which made it illegal to teach evolution in schools. Now, we're supposed to have a separation of church and state in the United States, so banning evolution on the basis of religion in a state-run program is really unacceptable, regardless of your religious or political beliefs. So the ACLU wants to challenge this law, so they convince a biology teacher, a high school biology teacher named John Scopes, to teach Darwinism in his class, get himself arrested so that they can challenge the law in court. So when he's arrested, the media goes totally nuts and they start calling it the monkey trial. So the ACLU hires really one of the best defense attorneys ever to defend John Scopes, and his name is Clarence Darrow. And then to represent the state of Tennessee, our good friend William Jennings Bryan is going to be the prosecutor. So remember, we saw him back when we were talking about populism. So the trial was absolutely insane, really the trial of the century. It was on the radio every day, so everyone was listening to it. It was in the news, like in the newspapers all the time. It was all anyone was talking about, and it was just really crazy, sort of pitting science against religion. So it was a really big deal. It all really came to a head when Clarence Darrow was told that he couldn't have any more witnesses who were scientists, so he decided to call William Jennings Bryan to the stand to serve as an expert on the Bible, because William Jennings Bryan saw himself as an expert on the Bible. And he starts off by asking him, do you take the Bible literally? Do you believe in, these things, giving him specific examples? And William Jennings Bryan was like, yes, absolutely. I believe that the Bible is 100% literal. And then Clarence Darrow just goes in on him and starts questioning him about all of these different variations in the Bible and all of these different theories and all of this stuff. And he just absolutely destroys William Jennings Bryan. And it's clear that Clarence Darrow has sort of made his point here that the Butler Act should not be a law. We shouldn't be regulating things like this in the public school system. Now, even though Clarence Darrow makes his point and all of the people listening to the trial at home get it, that doesn't necessarily mean that John Scopes is going to be found innocent. He did break the law by teaching evolution in schools, and there's not really much of a debate about that. So he is found guilty and fined $100. And that's not really what the case is about. Like I said, the ACLU, they weren't trying to make him be found not guilty. They just wanted to challenge this law, and they are definitely successful. And the Scopes trials is still today one of the most famous court cases in American history.